All right. Thank you all for being here today and responding in the Q&A that you can hear me loud and clear. Thank you very much. To introduce myself, I'm going to try to get our video up and running real quick. But I will start with introducing CISPA and myself. So welcome. Today we will have Shannon McClish, a PhD student in Hawaii right now for our Mind Walk lecture series, and she's got a great presentation ready for you. My name is Sierra Emmerich. I'm the interim co-executive director with CISPA, and I'm grateful to be here today. We also have Chrissy.
Hi, my name's Chrissy. I'm the new intern for the Mind Walks lecture, so you'll be hearing and seeing from me again. And thank you guys for being here.
Awesome. So just to give you a little background, Mind Walk our lecture series hosted by the California State Parks and the Central Coast State Parks Association, known as CISPA. They are hosted every month and alternate between in-person and virtual offerings. You can check out the list of upcoming lectures and an archive of our past recordings at the CISPA website, which is shown on our screen. The Mind Walk program is underwritten by the Thomas E. and Mary K. Ellsworth Fund and supported by our partners at the Central Coast State Parks Association. That's us. CISPA is a nonprofit that funds and supports educational programs in the state parks of San Luis Obispo County. They help to fund anything from new museum exhibits, school group transportation, or guided educational activities like this Mind Walk series. If you'd like to help us or support the Mind Walk program in particular or other state park educational opportunities, please check out the link on the bottom of the screen. Today's presentation will last roughly 30 to 45 minutes with time at the end for questions. To ask our presenter a question, you can go ahead and use the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we will actually read that question to Shannon at the very end. Today's program will be recorded, so if you need to head out early or want to share this presentation with someone else, it will be available to watch later. And now Chrissy is going to introduce our speaker.
Hey everyone, so I'm just going to give a little brief rundown on who Shannon is. Shannon McClish is a PhD candidate in Chemical Oceanography at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She researches how different ocean processes shape the distribution of carbon, oxygen, and nutrients in the ocean that are important for ocean organism and Earth's climate. Shannon grew up locally in Morro Bay and is continually inspired by the beauty and complexity of the Central Coast region.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here. Shannon, we will hand it over to you and we'll see you at the end of the presentation.
Awesome. All right. Can everyone see my screen? Good. So yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to be talking a little bit today about the Central Coast and the oceanography of the Central Coast, which is near and dear to my heart because I grew up in Morro Bay, like they mentioned. And this was really fun for me because I think a lot about the different processes that I will touch on, but on kind of a more global scale, and especially in remote places like the ocean around Antarctica. So I'll focus my talk today about how things that happen on larger scales affect the coast of Central California. So a little bit of an outline. I'm going to start just going over a little bit of the introduction to the ocean dynamics in the ecosystem that is beyond our shoreline, so off of the Central Coast. I'll give an example about why it's important to study these processes, and then go into oceans and climate change. So talking about both how globally climate change affects in the ocean and vice versa, and then talk about things a little bit more locally. So to kick it off, the Central Coast is part of the California Current System, which stretches from north of the Washington border all the way down to Baja, Mexico. It's a system that's is composed of multiple different currents. And off of the Central Coast, we primarily experience the California current, which brings colder, nutrient-rich water from the north down south. And then there's also what's called the California undercurrent, which is in this yellow arrow here that brings up water from the south. So the waters that are off our shore are actually a combination of subarctic Pacific water and then also tropical water that's coming from the south, as well as some component of water from the east. So you can see from these little boxes on this figure here, the green box and the blue box and the red box, those are waters of different origins that all come together to make up the water that's off our coast. So that's one example of how processes that happen elsewhere in the ocean really do all come together and impact where we are. So a super important process that really shapes the system in the ecosystem. So that's all of the animals and algae and stuff like that that occur off our coast is coastal upwelling. So the west coast of North America is one of the 4 major upwelling regions of the globe. And upwelling is a process that occurs when seasonal winds, so winds that come down the coast from the northwest in the spring and in the summer, push surface water offshore, and that occurs because of the Earth's rotation. So the winds come down the coast, and because the Earth is rotating, this causes offshore flow. And then when that water is displaced or pushed offshore, there's water that comes up from below, hence the term upwelling, and that water takes the place essentially of the water that has moved offshore, and that's kind of a cyclic process. So then that water is moved offshore, and that's a really important process because in the ocean is density stratified. So what that means is that you have warmer waters at the surface and then colder waters at depth. And those colder waters are nutrient rich. And that's because as the ocean is circulating and moving over time, those older, colder waters collect nutrients that are released into the ocean as organic matter is respired. So mainly what you need to remember is that the cooler waters that are upwelled are rich in nutrients and depleted in oxygen. And nutrient-rich waters are the reason that we have a really highly productive marine ecosystem on the California coast. So by productive marine ecosystem, I mean, you can think of it as like a very lush piece of land versus a desert. We could consider the lush region very productive, and that's because there's nutrients that fuel plant growth, and then those plant growths provide habitat and food as a resource for other organisms, and then those organisms create a resource for larger organisms, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of like, because of these cooler nutrient-rich waters, it allows that to happen. So what do we talk about when we talk about primary producers, or kind of the plant equivalent of the ocean? Those are phytoplankton. So I have a picture here. That's an example of a diatom, which is a type of phytoplankton that is found off of the Central Coast. And this is an example of a phytoplankton that would occur in what we refer to as phytoplankton blooms. So phytoplankton blooms are happen in response to upwelling. So upwelling is not a constant process. It's often very episodic because it's driven by winds. And as we know, winds can be very episodic. And so phytoplankton bloom occurs when you have strong winds that create upwelling. And then once that upwelling brings up nutrients such as nitrate and iron, and which phytoplankton need to grow, phytoplankton grow, and we can observe that because they change the color of the water to be more green, and you can actually see it from space. And once the phytoplankton grow, they become food for zooplankton, such as krill and copepods, and those that in terms provides a base of the food web for larger organisms, as well as filter feeders and other gelatinous organisms. But especially anchovies and krill are really important to sustain the fish that provide a economic resource to the Central Coast. So the type of phytoplankton will change over the season. And this happens in response to changing nutrients, changing light conditions, and also the interaction of things that eat phytoplankton. So those are all factors that can come together to change when and where the phytoplankton are able to bloom. And this is really something that's very important and scientists spend a lot of time thinking about because it can help inform everything from where there's going to be habitat for marine organisms to where there'll be strong and productive fisheries. Okay, so this is an example of the food web that grows out of these phytoplankton. So I circled in yellow some of the primary producers. So primary producers are things that photosynthesize, which means they use those nutrients I was talking about, as well as light from the sun to produce, to grow. And then those things provide the base of the food web for other organisms. So as you can see, in California, there's a very complex food web. And so there's scientists that are dedicated to study each part of this food web. So both the organisms, but also the processes that that affect the different organisms. So before I go any further, I just wanted to touch really quickly on one of the reasons we scientists study this, and then also as a community, why these processes affect us as a community. So as you may have guessed a little bit from what I've gone over so far, these processes are really interconnected. So change to one part of the system will ripple through. And the timing and environmental conditions is really important to shape where species can thrive. And understanding these processes can help us build better forecasts for how these things are going to change in the future, and those inform management strategies. So an example of this is in 2014 to 2016, there was what's known as a marine heat wave, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a sec. But this marine heat wave led to a compression of habitats, which is essentially when somewhere where organisms, the region where organisms could thrive becomes smaller. And so sometimes that creates overlap between species that are not used to having overlap in their habitats. So this marine heat wave led whales that rely on colder water to follow anchovies into a region where there was an active crab fishery. And this increased the amount of whale entanglements that year. And in turn, the crab fishery was shut down, which had an economic impact on the community. But recently, researchers have shown that using information about the different dynamics of the California current system and then also real-time observations that are collected along the coast, they can be able to predict when habitat compression will occur due to marine heat waves up to 9 months in advance. And that can give fishing communities, as well as like regulators, and then also just like people who help with marine mammal conservation, time to come up with a strategy about how to kind of like make sure this doesn't happen in the future. And this is just one example. There's so many examples of this, about how knowing more about what's going on off the shore can help make the coastal community more resilient. So now I'm going to go into talking a little bit about oceans and climate. And this is because the ocean plays a huge part in our global climate system, but also the oceans are changing as a result of anthropogenic or human-induced climate change. So this is a figure from an organization called the Global Carbon Budget, and they're dedicated to keeping track of where carbon flows through the whole global system, and the ocean plays a big part in that. So the ocean is responsible is what we term a carbon sink, and that means overall the ocean is taking up or absorbing some of the carbon that has been emitted to the atmosphere due to the fossil fuel combustion and industrial processes. And because this carbon is not in the atmosphere, it helps mitigate some of the warming that would have occurred if it was not taken up by the ocean. And the ocean is also a huge store of heat. So when fossil fuels are burned and release greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, that traps more heat into the Earth system. And about 90% of that heat has been absorbed into the ocean. So the oceans have warmed by more than a degree since the pre-industrial period. But this is a huge reason why our planet has not warmed more due to the burning of fossil fuels. So the ocean is like really a huge reason that our climate operates the way it does. But because of this absorption of carbon and heat that the ocean is absorbing, there's changes to the ocean, and that affects both marine species, but it also has feedbacks into the whole climate system. So I'll go over a couple different processes that are occurring in the ocean as a result of climate change. These are ocean warming, ocean acidification, and ocean deoxygenation. But I just wanted to show this cool, this is data from the National Marine Ecosystem Status Program for the California current region. So this is data that's been collected in many locations of the California coast. And they record like changes that have happening in the ocean, so we can see locally what those changes that we know are happening in the global ocean look like and how that might affect species. So the first chart is showing what's known as a heat wave coverage index. And basically what you can think of is higher values are more heat waves and longer heat waves. So you can see there's been spikes, and globally heat waves have become about 50 times more common than they were in the pre-industrial period, and heat waves are projected to just become more and more common in the future. So those that's one aspect of climate change in the ocean. Another one is ocean acidification. And the ocean acidification they keep track of by measuring the amount of CO2 that has been absorbed by the ocean. And so the California current has seen a increase in the amount of CO2. So we know the ocean is becoming more acidic off the coast. And another way to look at this is to look at the pH. So that's a measure of acidity of things. And you can also see the pH has decreased, which means the ocean is, again, becoming more acidic. So yeah, if you're interested, you can go look up this data. But another thing I wanted to mention is that there's also significant trends in deoxygenation that have been observed off our coast. Yeah, so marine heat waves, I'll just talk a little bit about this, but this graphic by the ICUN really shows why these events are important to think about, because they do affect many different aspects of the coast. So marine heat waves can happen for a variety of different reasons, but we do know that they are becoming more frequent with climate change. Essentially, what they are extended periods of regional ocean warming, and these impact both organisms, like marine organisms that live in the ocean. Everything from those phytoplankton up to whales are affected by this. And that's because just like humans, different organisms are used to very different temperature ranges, but also when you have warming, it can change the physics of the ocean. So it can affect how currents work, and it can affect what regions are supplied nutrients, and it can also lead to things like oxygen loss. And those things will all kind of vary regionally. And some species are definitely more affected by marine heat waves. So an example of that would be something like kelp forests or a seagrass region. And this is because kelp can't move when it gets warm. They can't just go, oh, it's too warm, I need to get out of here, because they're held in place. So yeah, and then this can also lead to economic loss. So this can lead to the closure of fisheries. It can also have an effect on tourism. And yeah, certain fisheries are a lot more susceptible to this. So another process that occurs in the ocean because of climate change is ocean deoxygenation. So at the surface, the ocean is exchanging oxygen with the atmosphere. So surface waters are well oxygenated, but waters deeper in the ocean have less oxygen. And that's because different biological processes will consume oxygen in the ocean. And when there's warming, it can affect the amount of mixing in the ocean, and that can make some parts of the ocean become less oxygenated because there's less mixing of higher oxygen water from the surface down below. So that's the primary way that we think of climate change impacting ocean deoxygenation, but it can also happen because the warming affects the way that currents work. And so it can affect how water's moving into the area may have, they may move to different areas, and then that can leave regions without like a re-oxygen supply. And that's important because there's lots of animals in the ocean that rely on oxygen. And it also alters chemical processes, which can have effects later on in things like the amount of nutrients. Okay, last thing I'll talk about the effect of climate change on the ocean is ocean acidification. So like I said, the ocean is absorbing carbon dioxide that is emitted from the atmosphere. And this drives a decrease in the pH of the ocean because it increases the hydrogen ion content. And you might think, well, why do I care if the ocean is acidic? But it really affects species in a couple different ways. So especially species that that have shells, because species often make their shells out of something called calcium carbonate, and that is really sensitive to the pH of the water. So both it can make it harder for organisms to make their shells, but also it makes it harder for the organisms to survive at all because they have to put more work or more energy into making their shells. So there's kind of like a couple different components of that. And so, yeah, ocean acidification also varies on different time scales. So, overall, globally, in a mean sense, which means that like a long average sense, the oceans are acidifying, but you can also have events such as marine heat waves or different just kind of physical processes in the ocean that will create short-term conditions that will really impact organism shells. And so this is something that people think about a lot on the Central Coast, and oysters. So there's a couple oyster farms in the area, and there's an increased amount of monitoring around those farms to make sure they can think about how ocean acidification could impact the oyster farms. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was climate change and the El Nino and La Nina cycles. So you hopefully have heard about El Nino or La Nina before if you're living in California. It's like a climate variation of global climate, has impacts everywhere. That is what we consider like a natural swing, a natural process that happens in our ocean. And as we know that El Nino years really do affect the coast in our coastline in many different ways. It affects fisheries because generally there's less nutrients due to less upwelling during these times, but also coastal erosion. So it's really important for scientists to think about what's going on offshore and during these El Nino or La Nina periods. But climate change, I really liked this graphic that's showing how climate change also impacts the natural processes that are going on in the ocean. Because under climate change, it's projected that El Nino and La Nina cycles will become basically a little bit more extreme, and there also might be more variation. But this is like a very hot topic in science. A lot of people are working on understanding this, and that's because the El Nino La Nina cycle does have such an impact on things like kelp forests and fisheries and coastal erosion, and then even more inland changes in the ocean, which is due to the El Nino La Nina, impact the overall weather for places no matter where you live. So it's not just a coastal issue, but yeah. So I'm going to end on a note of hope because I know I just did talk about climate change, and sometimes that can feel like, oh, a real bummer of a subject to talk about, but it is really important to talk about on our coastline. But I just wanted to show this figure from the latest IPCC report, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is just showing the warming that has occurred since the 1900s. So the more orange and blue and purple colors are really warm. But you can see there's the future is really up to us, both locally and globally. You know, every action does matter because every degree of warming or little choice that is made does have an impact, and we really are in control of whether we end up on a very low scenario where the warming stabilizes and then decreases, or a very high. So there's there's a lot of agency that we have over the continuation of these processes. And I also just wanted to talk a little bit about, go back to the example of why we study these things. And just say that I'm super grateful for all of the research that does happen off the California coast. There's a lot of work done by the by organizations such as NOAA and NOAA Fisheries, as well as different institutions in Monterey and San Diego, who are constantly going out to sea and spending months at a time at sea to take measurements and make sure and putting robots out into the ocean that can sense these things, to make sure that we have a good idea of what's going on and the processes overall. And that really does make the potential to have coastal resilience a lot more feasible. So yeah, I wanted to end by just putting up some resources if you would like to learn more. There's a couple different things I wanted to shout out, but the CENCUS, which is the Central and Northern California Ocean Observing System, they have a lot of data, including data from Morro Bay in Port San Luis, where you can look at how different things like ocean temperature and ocean salinity, and even like the amount of zooplankton are changing. And then you can also find some of that stuff on the NOAA Marine Ecosystem Status. And then also places like the Morro Bay National Estuary Program. And yeah, a couple others if you are interested in learning more. But with that, I guess I'll stop yapping and I'll take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Shannon, for that awesome presentation. It was so cool to see all the different things that are affecting our oceans and just emphasizing the interconnectedness of all these different systems and how they affect the smallest organism to even us. So really interesting presentation. Your research is so important, and we're really grateful for the work you're doing and for being here with us. We have a few questions in the chat that I will read to you. The first one is from Doreen Gardner, and she was wondering, could the marine heat wave have impacted the eelgrass in the estuary around 2014, 2016? And if I am not mistaken, was that the year, Doreen, where we had a really big increase in eelgrass? If you could confirm that, or if Shannon, if you know already.
Yeah, so sorry, I can't tell if I'm, oh yeah, I'm not muted. Okay, yeah, so I don't know specifically if it impacted the seagrass populations, but I would say that's a really good example of kind of how complicated these things can be. And that's because I know the seagrass has had a collapse and then has been on an overall increase, and people are still trying to figure out why there was a collapse and also what things caused an increase. And to do that, they really have to take into account both things like the temperature of the bay, but also things like turbidity, which is like how much like sediment and mixing there is in the bay, and then other things like oxygen and nutrients in the bay. So that kind of shows you like a little bit about all the things that need to happen. But certainly changes in temperature can have a huge impact on organisms such as seagrass, because they are really reliant on a relatively small temperature range. So that's why here in Hawaii, we don't have seagrasses, because the water is too warm. So I don't know specifically, but I would, I know some people at Cal Poly do study that pretty in depth, because I saw some papers on it. So maybe you can reach out to the Cal Poly Marine Science Department. I'm sure they would have your answer.
Awesome. And Doreen said, I believe it started decreasing around that time. So yeah, it might have aligned with the marine heat wave. That's very interesting. Thank you for the question, Doreen. We have another question from Judith. She says, how sensitive to these changes are larger mammals like sea lions, otters, and seals?
Yeah, so that's a difficult question to answer in one part, which sorry, some of these questions might be, but overall, like in terms of temperature change, larger animals tend to have like a bit of a higher tolerance um, because they are mammals. But it may affect them more in terms of food resources. So this aspects of change like warming or acidification can have bigger effects on the amount of distribution or a habitat for different species that those things eat. And then that can cause a shift in where sea lions or other organisms like that can live because they will essentially have to follow their food. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of an example of how things will kind of have a ripple effect. Um, but yeah.
We have another question from Madeline. She's wondering, how much effect does the Diablo power plant have on the warming of the ocean,
Mm,
of ocean water?
ocean water. So yeah, so from what I know, the power plant does use ocean water to like cool certain things, and then in the outflow, it will release water back into the ocean that is slightly warmer. So I think it will have a very local effect, but overall, not a hugely significant effect. Um, and that is just because the ocean is really big and because of the upwelling off the coast, which brings that colder water up. And that is a reason why the upwelling, bringing that colder water up is not just shaping the marine ecosystem, but it also has such a big impact that it shapes the weather that we experience. And it kind of is one of the reasons why we have more mild weather on the central coast just in general. So the processes of upwelling is really dominant in controlling the sea surface temperature.
Um, so no more questions in the chat, so everyone feel free to keep adding questions as they come up. But I had a question for Shannon. I was wondering how ocean warming affects our currents. Are they slowing down? Are some of them speeding up? Are they changing directions? What's going on?
Yeah, so that's really fascinating. And I would say so it happens on different scales. So warming, it depends where is warming, first of all, but the warming in general can cause increased stratification. And what that means is there's greater disconnect between the surface waters and the waters below because the water on top gets really warm and that decreases the density of that water. And that makes it harder to mix the really lighter waters, less dense waters, and the denser waters below. Because if you think about it, light things like to sit on top of heavy things, so it decreases mixing. And so that's one way in which warming can alter the currents. But the other way is just because warming will change the winds, because like warming in the atmosphere affects the winds, and the surface currents are really wind driven. So that's another process that affects the currents. And then overall ocean warming, because the ocean is warming not just at the surface but at depth, and that has an effect for kind of the more slower inner ocean circulation. But and so the net effect of what happens to the currents is kind of all of those things. So you have to scientists really have to think about like, okay, what's going on? Is it an El Nino and we have some warming in the North Pacific? That's going to change currents very differently than if there's warming more in the south or something like that. So it's not just one simple effect, it's kind of like the overlap of all those different processes. But in general, in terms of like having warmer waters, that's usually related to lower winds. and that leads to less upwelling. So that's not really a current, but that's more of a like a dynamic processes that gets affected.
Awesome. Thank you for that thorough response. If anybody else has a question, go ahead and throw it in the chat. If not, Shannon, I know, has to leave in a few minutes to go teach a class. Shannon, what class are you teaching?
It's called Science of the Sea, and we're talking about sea level rise today.
Oh.
So, yeah.
But so I think we'll go ahead and let her go if there's no further questions from our audience. But we want to say thank you again to Shannon McClish for joining the virtual Mind Walk lecture series today. And thank you to everyone who attended this lecture. It means a lot to us to have you here. For all the attendees, when you exit the webinar, there will be a short survey that appears on your screen. It's not required, but it would be extremely helpful to us to hear feedback from you to better your experience with the virtual Mind Walk series. So we appreciate your time and we hope everyone has a great weekend. Chrissy, you have anything?
Yeah.
Thank you, Sierra. And yeah, for having me. It was really a pleasure. And also, I'm just such a fan of everything that CSWA does. So yeah.
Thank you, Shannon. Bye, everyone.